Hey folks, if you're looking for an in-depth review, you're in the right place. As for today's topic, I found myself with a key courtesy of Summit Reviews. Namely, a copy of Pyxeralia's Mists of Noyah, an expansive hack and slash with a side order of survival and crafting. But was this combination a carefully constructed experience, or a foggy facsimile that failed to be fun? I'm your host Arlyeon, let's find out together. Once the land flourished, and yet, with the corruption of its monarch, Veramis, every day brings the continent a little closer to the brink of annihilation. And so the grim task of regicide falls on the brave few who still remain. Or something of that sort. Admittedly, there actually isn't any form of ongoing story or satisfactory resolution to the game as you progress forward, with the entirety of Noyah's backstory being contained within a quinte of scrolls that you can purchase from a vendor, each of which provide a rather dense chunk of backstory from the perspective of the various player characters. Now, while these do provide a bit of context for how the characters know each other, they don't actually wind up feeling all that relevant, partly because the situations they describe wind up being an altogether separate adventure, which culminates in the almost arbitrary corruption of Veramis and his essential appointment as the last boss. That's right, our ultimate antagonist for this title, a fact that's highlighted in his entry in the boss bestiary, is more a victim of circumstance rather than some grand schemer due any semblance of comeuppance. I mean, sure, his entry does state that he's since decided it'd be a great idea to plunge the world in the darkness, but the stakes don't really feel there because he actually isn't the source of it all. Especially since in practice, I was crossing my fingers and waiting for the corruption meter to max out as quickly as possible. It's not like it mattered mechanically. With that being said, I suppose now's as good a time as any to start unpacking everything that Mists of Noyah does mechanically. A task that's made tricky given there's just so many elements that feel pertinent to address. Part of the confusion lies in the simple fact that this game wears a lot of hats insofar as genre identity, a matter which I'll address later, and yet there is a simple unavoidable truth. As a hack and slash, there is often combat to contend with literal small armies of antagonists to annihilate. If only the quality of these encounters was anywhere on par with the sheer quantity. Admittedly, it took me a little while to notice, as I took my time progressing through the game, but one of the key elements that actually frustrated me about Noyah was the sheer fact that whilst it has an air quote diverse end air quote range of enemies to encounter, the bulk of its numbers were in effect copy-pastes of each other. Sure, they look different based on the environment you are currently in, but their behavior and attack animations were so bland and repetitive, combat encounters felt samey. Something that's especially notable when you come face to face with seemingly special enemies like the rare supply carts, whose main attack is spontaneously spawning gaggles of generic goons at you, or the faction-specific mini-bosses whose tactics are to spawn even more enemies while also punishing melee characters with an overpowered damaging aura. Real bracing stuff there, which is made slightly more irritating by the fact that there actually isn't any thought placed into enemy placement. What I mean by that is, enemies don't populate the world in clever layouts. Instead of well thought out enemy arrangements that will test your tactical savvy, your antagonists will teleport into existence in an entirely arbitrary manner. Really, the closest thing to any sort of strategic nuance for the enemy spawns is the fact that different, more difficult enemies spawn at night. But even then, the crux of them feel like more of the same, with the largest difference being an escalated threat level as well as better experience and unique drops. That is, until you let the corruption meter ramp up. See, as time goes by, the corruption of your save file gradually increases, serving as an indicator to how messed up and harsh the world becomes. Rather literally, given that at certain breakpoints, it amps up enemy difficulty, spawn rate, as well as rewards for overcoming them. It also introduces corruption-specific enemies for the nighttime segments, which are actually somewhat notable for being distinct from a number of their peers. That said, they also have the bad habit of overwhelming the native spawns of a given biome, even with the increase in spawn rates, which actually interferes with the game's quest system to a considerable degree. Now, questing in Noyah is a bit different from most RPGs, since instead of them being collected from NPCs and used to advance the story, they mostly exist as goals in a menu to achieve, granting you experience to advance, some money, and resources. Admittedly, it's a bit vague on the whole what sort of resources they give, so figuring that out mostly is a matter of checking what you already have and seeing what's new. That said, you do have some things to look forward to, as you earn chests on the quest page at certain landmarks, which provide access to ample amounts of crafting and upgrade materials, so it does increase the value of interacting with the questing system. Note that I didn't use the words worthwhile, and part of that simply because it's very hard to gauge that qualifier, given that each of these quests will take a long while. See, while you're given a few quest branches to navigate between, there's a rather hefty amount of drive involved in a number of these, whether it's due to requiring uncommon monster spawns, which are overwritten by nighttime enemies, rare material drops, or even just normal acts of murder. These processes can be timely, to the point that it wasn't even uncommon for me to sit there farming for anywhere between 20 minutes to an hour to clear a single quest. And that was at max corruption, where monsters were spawning twice as fast, and while chugging potions to earn double drops for certain quests and crafting bits. At this juncture, tedious would be a charitable bit of phrasing, to the point that I actually reached the final boss and the end dungeon at 27 hours in. As for the next 14.9 of them, they were majoritarily spent grinding out quests and levels in a process that felt like pulling teeth. In fact, for most areas, I found that running around in an effort to track down spawning monsters felt pointless and often less time efficient than simply sitting on a ladder and letting my minion rack up kills and item drops while I ate a sandwich. Or hung out at a pier lazily fishing in the depths of hell while my minion went to town. Not hyperbole, by the way. And whilst you might think that I would have at least earned ample crafting materials by doing this, you'd be wrong. At least for any that felt relevant to what I was doing, because sure, I could entirely glut up my inventory and then another 7+ boxes of storage space with more rocks than a junkie geologist, but the simple fact of the matter was, crafting stopped being relevant for me at level 15 to 20 if I'm being charitable for the snorkel so I could breathe underwater. But honestly, that's what water breathing potions were for. I still engaged with the system, mostly to finish off crafting quests and then store my goods in my storage so I could swap them to alts and level them up for science, but well, the moment I got access to dungeons, there was no real point to crafting anything. Dungeons at least are actually somewhat interesting given they eschew the randomness of the game's spawns and pit you against obstacle courses of enemies and traps. It is, in fact, the closest thing you'll get to somewhat well thought out enemy arrangements, plausibly in large part because enemies are immune to traps and will happily bump you in order to deliver you straight into the maws of instant death. Because yeah, when you first start accessing dungeons, every swinging blade, every gratuitous floating spear, and explosive plant will likely pop you like a zit. Really, you should fill out a will and testament before you commit to these because you'll be here a while, though if you're a fan of things like Meat Boy, you might take some sort of perverse masochistic pleasure out of the process, especially as you watch your experience drop in chunks with every death. Really, the only ones I actually enjoyed insofar as the design and mechanics were the Water and Hell dungeons, as they felt the least obnoxious about their death traps. Thankfully, even with the abundance of murderous mechanisms, I do have to give the dungeons credit. They're somewhat forgiving with checkpoints, enemies don't respawn, and you actually have the option in the menu for getting right back into the thick of things without marching a marathon mile to the dungeon entrance. At least until you clear it and have to open up yet another instance in the name of farming. Just making a shortcut was just beyond them. Oh, what's more, the boss encounters here are a plus, as they're actually wholly unique processes which differentiate themselves notably from the rest of the game, even if the first one feels like a middle finger to melee characters. And beyond that middle finger part, this is a good thing, since you actually have to beat all of them in order to access the very final dungeon. That said, what I felt was the most important thing here is, beating them causes them to explode into loot piñatas, which are often worlds above anything you can craft, a process that can be repeated on the heroic, read harder difficulty in order to gain gear which, even for the first dungeon, provides a substantial enough boost to hold their own in the final dungeon. And then you reach mythic variants, which are actually somewhat unique as compared to their earlier difficulty peers. They're also absolute death traps, given the health and damage of everything are glutted, and continue to ramp up with each new mythic level you obtain. That said, the element that's most apt to kill you is the fact that as you progress forward, you begin to earn modifiers, ranging from enemies blowing up when they die, and probably killing you, to powering up boss survivability to drag out the fight, or such timeless classics as yet more traps because why not? It's such a misery hole, Edmund McMillan would be proud. Oh, and before I forget, they're timed. Yeah, if you want to access higher mythic tiers, you actually have to clear them within a relatively strict time limit, which might have you wondering what it could possibly provide that would make the whole rigmarole worthwhile. And to that, I have to say, bragging rights mostly. Because while they do drop mythic gear, what that equates to is the drops that they'd normally give on heroic level, but very slightly boosted based on the level of mythic you earned it on. I actually found the gains to be insubstantial even at Mythic 9, and by that point I was juggling a slew of simultaneous modifiers for each of these fucking dungeons. Which is why I leaned away from farming and simply focused on heroics, since they were more than enough to provide me good equipment and all the materials I needed to upgrade my gear. A process I needed to make as time efficient as possible because Noyah's loot upgrading system feels like they were pulled straight out of an MMO. It's actually sort of traumatizing, really, because if you love the way upgrading a weapon in Vindictus both disrespected your time and elicited anxiety with a roulette of, will this upgrade or will it power itself down, you're in luck. That's right, the pulse-pounding process of stocking up on upgrade stones and then just hitting an upgrade button for 20 minutes, trying to get an item to plus 15 only to watch it instead level down to plus 6, and leaving you poor to boot, is in full play here, and made all the more agonizing by unskippable animations which sometimes feel like they're stalling. It does get marginally better at the very tail end of the game with the addition of the ultimate upgrade material, but even then, expect to sit there mashing upgrade for 10 minutes per item. That's far from the only upgrading system either, since you can also modify the affixes of your gear. This one's more of a net positive for the most part, however, since it means you can add 2 guaranteed affixes to something that originally had none, and it's not too time-consuming to get a pair that are at least marginally useful. But optimizing this is frequently a nightmare, especially when you factor in weapon-specific affixes, since each one is rolled entirely randomly, and there's no way to lock even one into place. So if you're trying to get that lucky combination of 2, good fucking luck. Still, that brings us to the most inoffensive gear boosting option. The ability to upgrade the rarity of an object by sacrificing a number of items that are of an equal rarity or higher. And this one's actually a lifesaver, since waiting for something to drop at a higher rarity can take a while. If you've already finagled ideal affixes, looking for something new hardly feels worth it. The only limitation here is you can't access legendary rarity, but I can count the number of legendary items I found during the entirety of my playthrough on both my hands, honestly. It didn't ever get past that, so big whoop. Though on the subject of big whoops, we have yet another of my grievances, a topic I've yet to broach but is more than overdue. Specifically, the simple fact of just how painful it is to think about the vast emptiness that marks the game's world. Which is weird, since Noyah isn't a roguelite. The world is handcrafted, is built and designed, and yet just so friggin' empty. I've lost track of the time I just sat there mashing the shift key to just dash from place to place because the experience felt bland. And because while the game does provide town portal scrolls to return to town, they don't actually provide you a viable means of returning to where you came from. I mean, sure, there are certain resource chests scattered around as well as mining nodes, but as you may have ascertained, any inclination to open them up dwindled as dungeoneering became a full-time job. Even the existence of the collectible relics scattered around the world couldn't rekindle a desire to check out the far corners of it. But then, there's a reason for that. Remember how I said you lose experience when you die? That's not the only thing you lose. You lose every single one of these power-up relics, which is hilarious when you consider that each one provides an extremely minute amount of stats, ranging around 1% to 0.5%. So yes, you can entirely scour this vast, lonely region in search of these minute additions to your character, collecting 20 or even 30 of them in order to get an edge in combat by scrounging just every little nook and cranny. But you'll also have to come to terms with the awareness that you will lose all of that progress, all of that time, the moment you die due to contact damage to some monster zipping through a wall and just knocking you into a dumb trap or some other unfortunate end. A waste in time only compounded by the idea that if you intend on retrieving them, they'll be randomly rearranged to the world and you'll be lacking a proper map to investigate each individual area. Because yes, while there is technically a map, it doesn't actually really showcase where you are or the actual rooms that you're in. Oh, and speaking of odd design choices, even the hub town isn't spared, as its various facilities are spaced out to a considerable degree, often turning your attempts at crafting, upgrading, or potion making into not so insubstantial hiking trips. Which is made all the more funnier once you realize that there's actually some base building elements in the game which allow you to make various facilities in order to acquire certain resources. Admittedly, this facet's rather vague, as while you can guess the purpose of some of the buildings, others aren't quite as apparent, and the sheer amount of resources needed made the exercise feel moot. Especially once I ascertained that the town isn't actually safe. Because there are invasions. As your corruption ramps up, your town will occasionally be attacked by those aforementioned armies of antagonists. While this did serve to disincentivize me from building stuff, I actually didn't hate these. They provided heaps of experience, certain uncommon or rare resources, and most importantly, successfully guarding your town actually provides a chock full of upgrade materials from a handy-dandy chest. It's neat, albeit extremely unfrequent, so if you're hoping to rely on it for some sick gains, don't count on it. Also, don't get complacent, since if you drag your heels, possibly because you're busy fighting a boss and thus unable to town portal, they will kill every single NPC in your town, forcing you to craft phoenix feathers to revive them. Or to start a new world seed with revived NPCs and a reset corruption meter, because, yeah, like I said, there's no real random generation at play, and if everything's a nuisance, why not? I mean, I suppose you do have the option of trying to harangue people on your Steam wishlist in order to try and suffer through this game with you and look after the town, but I'm gonna level with you guys. I went through this entire game solo. I'm not actually sure if multiplayer players would have modified anything like it insofar as enemy spawns or health, or how the difficulty might have been modified per player, including for just quest drops, because I couldn't convince anyone to play this with me. What I can say is, it definitely didn't feel good solo, and certain player characters actually lost portions of their kit, as their skills and passives were specifically geared towards supporting or working in concert with other people. Which, right, okay, so, characters. Mist of Noyah has 5 distinct ones, each with their own movesets and skill trees to set them apart. That said, I did find the game to be notably more punishing for melee characters. Things like unavoidable damage areas, bullet hell levels of projectiles, and hideous bits of zoning, in tandem with contact damage enemies who don't know the meaning of personal bubble, all conspire to direct me towards the ranged characters, and then very specifically the Hydromancer, if only because of her distinct kit. Being able to summon a water elemental that forces enemies to ignore you in favor of it is amazing in and of itself, but also being able to redirect some of the damage dealt to her to it is instead a lifesaver, given the sheer amount of damage everything did. Even at the end of the game, with extremely leveled up armor and gear, I was in the 2 to 3 shot range for most heavy hitting creatures. Which is where her bubble skill comes into play. A skill which was also the main reason for me farming up the resources to make a respect potion and redo my build. And that's because of how limited your leveling is. You only get 3 skill points per level, capping at 180 total if you reach level 60. And the thing is, whilst it might seem like a good idea to level skills because their efficiency increases, their cooldown decreases, and hitting that much vaunted level 15 grants an additional major effect, leveling skills also increases their cost, often to a prohibitive degree. And even on the mage, mana recovery was a major problem. To actually get through the final boss fight, I actually had to craft a heap of mana potions for just that single encounter. And more often than not, I would simply let the water elemental do a lot of the heavy lifting while I spammed the basic attack to conserve MP. That's how big of an issue it was. It was, in fact, in my favor to exit the game just to replenish it. That's how slow the recovery was, how long it would take. Which brings me back to the bubble skill. Initially, I'd leveled this up, thinking that it was going to just save the day for me and provide this really useful bit of utility, but not only was it horribly expensive, I quickly found out that it had a particular limit. Regardless of how much you level it, it could never exceed twice your health as a damage shield, which also meant, given that I had an excess amount of magic attack, it granted me a capped shield at level 1. A shield which is eminently important since excess damage doesn't roll over, allowing you to survive attacks that should instantly kill you. Other than the last boss, who has a really stupid and finicky one-shot mechanic. Fuck that guy, and fuck his stupid flying monster that you have to kill in 1 or 2 seconds while he body blocks you and threatens to instantly kill you with contact damage. But I digress. The point is, weird bits of jank like this, or odd scaling, exist in all the characters, and it was often the passive skills which gave the most bang for your buck, as you were able to permanently incorporate them in your build without any major issues. What's more, a disproportionate amount of all of the characters scaled off one stat, being magic attack for all of their skills, which mostly led to me maximizing that on my gear, and being able to swap it between them in the communal storage chest as I tried to get a feel for them because nothing else mattered. Also, using the single perk point you get every level in order to further boost their magic attack for maximized glass cannon goodness. Yes, I had technically options to slightly boost my health. No, it wouldn't have helped me because things needed to die faster because of how tanky they got. And really, I should mention, the only character who benefits from something other than magic attack in their skill tree is the archer. And if they max out the passive that would benefit from something other than magic attack, it gains the ability to benefit from magic attack. This fucking game, I'm so mad. And I'm not even done. I'm not done because we're at the aesthetics segment. And by this point, you should know exactly what the complaint is. Because no matter how nice the NPCs in town look, or how flashy the protagonist's ability look, which are admittedly really fucking spectacular at times, it doesn't make up for the blandness of your opposition. At the end of the day, it doesn't overly matter if you make certain enemies look a bit different if their movements and attacks are a copy-paste of each other. And as far as the music goes, it's a bit of a mixed bag, because whilst half the time you get to listen to the daytime theme of each region, which aren't actually that bad, the other half of the time you'll be subjected to the theme for nighttime. That's right, while night has its own theme, symbolic of the increased danger, it is a theme that drowns out the variety that would otherwise mark each region. And boy do I hate that theme, because it's unskippable. There is no alternate night themes for each area. There's just one overarching anthem that dogs your step as you march through the world and occupies half your fucking time in the game. It's actually a shame. Also, whilst I would have liked to enjoy the end credits, that theme has a weird sort of overlap with the town's theme, as the game transports you there, but forgets to mute the second track while it's rolling the credits. So you get this really weird overlapped theme that is absolutely awful to listen to. But hey, speaking of the credits, it's almost that time for this review, so let's sum things up. And honestly, if you can't see where this is going after everything I've said, surprise! I absolutely hated this. Not at first, mind you. There was actually a bit of time near the start where I had fun learning and unlocking abilities on characters and puttering around, and yet, as the grind and tedium gradually accrued, I felt increasingly bamboozled. This is a game that actually provides you some legitimately powerful feeling platforming, the ability to double jump, wall cling, and then reset that double jump by clinging back and grappling on, so you could have had some really interesting puzzles here. And just engage with the world in a fairly creative, interesting manner. And then this is horribly underutilized, save for a couple dungeon segments. Otherwise, engaging in that sort of platforming just often earns you dead ends and a chunk of time wasted. What your time is better served by is spamming dash for several minutes worth of screens, in part because the developer despised placing accessible checkpoints, especially near dungeons. That is a problem. It remains a problem. I'm just fucking mad, okay? Add in the material clutter, by the way. horrific drop rates and the fact that if you do actually let things accumulate, the game will start to chug, and the various gear upgrading systems, and I can safely say that I've had my time respected more by Korean MMOs. At least those have a fucking market to buy rare drops needed for crafting. Combat 2 lost its lure early on, the relatively limited skill set that you got to pit not against carefully arranged enemies that forced clever uses, but against just continual onslaughts whose survival could mostly be measured in how much time I needed to spend stun locking or knocking them back with normal attacks until one attack came off cooldown. Gone were my hopes of weaving attacks together, it's just attrition. The whole thing is attrition and grind. And yet, from what I can gather, Mists of Noyah functions as intended. That's it. That's all I can say for it, really. And that's the furthest thing from a compliment, given that it was actually my playthrough of Ender Lilies that kept my spirits high enough to finish this game. Which is why at the end of the day, I can't recommend Mists of Noyah. I won't even give it a mixed review. Whilst I only got to play through it as a single player experience, that experience was an abject failure and one that's going to stick with me for some time. So yeah, no, this is a fail rating. Fanfare. Anywho, thanks for tuning in. If you agree, disagree, or just have something to say to me, feel free to comment. And if you enjoy my efforts to create new indie reviews, interviews, and gaming content, hit the subscribe button and the bell so you know there's a new release. For the Discord savvy folks, click the video description to find a link to my community, the Crit Hit Cauldron, and to my Patreon so you can support me and the other members of Crit Hit. Lastly, if you want to see me get dunked on in indie games live, check out my Twitch at twitch.tv/Arlyeon. With that said, I'll catch y'all on the next episode of Crit Hit. Take care till then, folks.